Okay, I think it is time for us to get going. Hello and welcome to this very special event delivered by the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, the BCSP. My name is Imran Khan. I'm the Executive Director of the BCSP, and it's my real pleasure to be hosting you here today. If this is your first BCSP event, welcome. We are a research and education institution based at UC Berkeley, dedicated to exploring the potential of psychedelics for the benefit of all. As part of that mission, and with support from the Stephen Alexandra Cohen Foundation, the BCSP recently launched a free, comprehensive university-level course on the science, history, and culture of psychedelics. That course is called Psychedelics and the Mind, and you can find it on edX right now. We'll be putting a link in the chat. To mark the moment, we've convened this really special panel to discuss psychedelic science, to discuss psychedelic education, and after our expert panel discussion, we will have a public Q&A, so please do get your questions ready. Before that, though, we have four really amazing speakers. We are going to have Nicole Vinnola, who is the Emmy Award-winning producer of our course. We're going to have Dölen, who is Associate Professor of Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University. We have Michael Pollan, who is one of the co-founders of the BCSP and also author of How to Change Your Mind. And of course, we also have David Presti. David is Teaching Professor of Neurobiology here at UC Berkeley and is the main man behind our new course. David, I wondered if I could dive straight in with you with a very, very basic question, please, for the uninitiated. Could you explain what are psychedelics? What is it that makes something a psychedelic and why are they important?
Well, I think psychedelics are, thank you, Imran, for that incredible introduction to this event, and welcome everyone out there. Thanks for being here and for your interest in this subject. Briefly, psychedelics can be said to be materials, usually considered to be drugs or plants or fungi that occasion powerful mental experiences. They act upon the brain and the body in some way as to produce very powerful experiences that can alter perception, alter the access and intensification of our thoughts and feelings, and even access to things that are otherwise not conscious, the personal unconscious, maybe the larger unconscious. And there is a current enthusiasm for the findings that have been accumulated over the last 60 or 70 years in contemporary psychiatry and psychology, that they can catalyze healing among folks who are experiencing various kinds of mental distress. They're also known to catalyze connections with a sense of the divine or the sacred. So they're all of those things. So in this way, they go beyond the properties of other known kinds of psychotropic substances. I like to think about psychedelics in the context of the original meaning of that word, psychedelic. When it was coined in the 1950s, it was meant to, based on the roots of psyche and delios, meaning to manifest the mind or manifest the psyche. And in the ancient Greek, the psyche meant more than just one's personal thoughts and feelings. In fact, it may not have meant that at all. It meant spirit or soul or some kind of sacred breath of life, kind of more akin to prana in Indian cosmology. So in that sense, psyche has been narrowed in its definition in contemporary language to mean kind of something more personal, our own thoughts and feelings and memories and so forth. And that is true. It is all of that. And it is also, in the original meaning, and I think still much larger. So what psychedelics can do is they can catalyze a connection to a much larger, more expansive notion of sentience or mind in nature. So that's kind of a short definition of how I would conceptualize psychedelic.
I really love the fact that you go back to the original meaning of the word psyche and delios, and you talk about that at great length in the course. So thank you. One of the things I wanted to touch on, David, is you've been teaching about drugs in the brain here at UC Berkeley for over 25 years. And now we have this amazing production of your work that's gone online. But I was wondering if you talk about, as an educator, how has the context for teaching about psychedelics and teaching about drugs changed over those years, and how did that change in context affect how you approach this new course, Psychedelics and the Mind?
Yeah. Well, it's been a great privilege to teach on this particular subject for so many years at UC Berkeley. And because within the broad category of drugs and how they impact brain, mind, and behavior, one really touches on so many important aspects of society. So not only the chemical properties or the botanical properties of where these materials come from, but the fundamentals of biology and neurobiology, and also how the culture interacts with these things and cultural policy and law and Supreme Court cases, and all these things can be brought into basically an introductory course. And over the course of those years, of course, the cultural engagement with various substances has shifted in many important ways, and to bring to the attention of students the vast landscape of how society interacts with drugs writ large is an educational opportunity to touch upon a lot of things. And so that has continued to evolve. So every year it's different. And it's not just that there's more science, there's the whole landscape has shifted in major ways. And of course, with psychedelics, the landscape has shifted hugely just in the past 3 years. If we look at the commercialization and the legalization and decriminalization initiatives, all around the country, all around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. We're going to come back to some of that, I'm sure, but I wondered if I could turn to Gul next. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're battling time zone and technology issues in being with us today, so I really appreciate it. Your research on psychedelics and their role in reopening critical periods in the brain features really prominently in David's course. And one of the things you talk about in the course, in Psychedelics in the Mind, is that you study a number of different psychoactive drugs, not just psychedelics. I wonder if you could talk about what is it in your view that sets psychedelics apart?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, and it's been a real pleasure to be part of this course. David is known worldwide as one of the best teachers, and I just felt so happy to get to participate in this. So specifically to your question, we felt like it was really important to try and define not only what psychedelics are and how they're affecting the brain, and differentiate them from other drugs that also are psychoactive and psychotropic, working on the brain, having properties that are sort of prominently brain activation properties. Because psychedelic is the kind of term where, if you haven't done it, it maybe is not that hard, not that easy to access what it is that they do. And so typically the way that neuroscientists have defined it is, an altered state of consciousness. But there are a lot of things that alter our states of consciousness. And what I think makes psychedelics different from these other types of psychoactive drugs that are not necessarily psychedelic is that they really seem to change the way that you perceive the world, both from a sensory point of view, so changes in the intensity, and also the access to, not just visual, but touch and motor, and all of these different percepts. And the drug that we have mostly compared to that it's a psychoactive but not psychedelic is cocaine. And that's because cocaine is also able to induce certain properties in the brain, like plasticity, and yet cocaine does not have the same therapeutic efficacy in terms of treating neuropsychiatric diseases like PTSD and addiction, that there's so much enthusiasm around. It's still, research is ongoing, but there's a lot of enthusiasm for treating neuropsychiatric diseases with psychedelics, and cocaine really doesn't have that property. And so we want to be able to differentiate the things that are shared in common with psychedelics from those that are not, if we're going to have any hope of trying to explain the therapeutic properties.
Thanks, Colin. And I love that you differentiate the different types of neuroplasticity, the idea that yes, different drugs can cause the brain to change, but not all change is the same.
That's right.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you're particularly famous for, if I might say, is your work where you administered MDMA, or sometimes called ecstasy, to octopuses. I wondered if you could talk us through that work. What did it reveal? Why did you do it? Why was it so important? How did the octopuses feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people sort of are amused by it, and it's certainly an odd kind of experiment. But the reason that we did it is because we were interested in the evolution of the brain, and octopuses are so evolutionarily distant from us. In fact, there's roughly 650 million years of evolution between us and our last common ancestor with an octopus, meaning that, dinosaurs have come and gone in the interim. And so the fact that their brains are so different and they're evolutionarily so different really begs the question, are psychedelics going to have the same effect on an octopus that doesn't have any of the brain regions that we have typically attributed to being the functional underpinning of these psychedelic actions? Because, we talk about, in vertebrates, we talk about, the cortex, or we talk about the amygdala, or we talk about the nucleus accumbens, these brain regions as being involved in enabling the psychedelic effects of these drugs. And an octopus doesn't have any of those brain regions. And so, it was really, really somewhat surprising, especially for someone like me who spent so much time focused on trying to understand the neural circuitry of psychedelics, that an animal that doesn't have any of these brain regions was able to respond in a way that was very similar to the way that rodents and humans respond to MDMA. So in other words, when we gave the MDMA to an octopus, they exhibited the same sort of pro-social approach behaviors, even though octopuses, for the most part, so of the 300 or so known species, all but one, as far as we know so far, is deeply asocial. So aggressively asocial, and will attack or try to kill another octopus if you put them in the same tank. And after MDMA, not so much.
And you said it was surprising that you had that result, given how distantly related we are to octopuses. What are the implications of that finding? What does it tell you?
I mean, for me, it's caused a shift in the way that I understand what my experiments are telling me. So, I think that it reminds us that we need to exercise caution when we look at a brain scan, or in my case, a neural circuit diagram, and say, oh, this is the brain region that lit up. This is the brain region that this is the neural circuit that if we, manipulate, it can interfere with these effects. That is true, but it's also misleading if you think that you suddenly now understand everything that is needed to affect those brain state changes, and that it's just one instantiation, and that an octopus that doesn't have those brain regions really does it in another way. And what it tells us is that the sort of nitty-gritty part of it, or the functional part of it, is probably coming down to the molecular level rather than the circuits and anatomy that is just one instantiation of how to solve that problem.
Thank you. And I hope we can dig into that more in the discussion or the Q&A later. But Michael, I'd love to come to you next. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, especially given you're often credited with helping fuel the present psychedelic resurgence with your book, How to Change Your Mind. Believe it or not, it's been 5 years since it's come out. I wondered if I could ask, what made you want to write How to Change Your Mind? Was it because you wanted to kick off this psychedelic renaissance?
No, definitely not. Thank you, Imran, and thanks to everybody on the panel and for people who are tuning in. I was following my curiosity. I'd had a long-standing interest in our symbiotic relationship with plants, and have always, been curious as to how these plants, we changed them and they changed us. And I'd also had a long-standing interest in this most unusual application of plants in human society, which is we use them to change consciousness. Every culture on Earth, with one exception, I think that's been found, has some plant or fungus they use to change consciousness. And that struck me as very interesting human desire. I'd written about that in The Botany of Desire in the case of cannabis. But when I heard around 2010 or 12 that psychedelics were being used in clinical research, and specifically I heard about an experiment where psilocybin was being given to terminal cancer patients. And that struck me as the most peculiar idea. Why would you do that? Why would you, if you had a diagnosis like that, would you even risk taking a psychedelic? So I set out to write an article about that. That ended up in the New Yorker. It's called The Trip Treatment. And it was in the process of interviewing these volunteers who had such remarkable stories of transformation, people who lost their fear of death after a single psychedelic experience, people who experienced powerful spiritual growth and a utter change in perspective. That, a chemical in the brain could do this was stunning to me. And in the course of somewhere halfway through the writing of that article, I realized I wanted to write a book on it. That these substances had a lot to teach us about things I was very interested in, including consciousness, including addiction, depression, that their impact was wide and worth looking at. And the whole time I was writing it, I was kind of worried because nobody else was writing about it, at least for the mainstream press. There's a psychedelic press, which is very, uncritical and on board. And I wasn't. I was coming at psychedelics as someone who hadn't used them, who was skeptical. So anyway, the whole time, I was wondering, like, where is everybody? Normally, when you're writing about anything, you're in a competitive relationship. I remember when I was writing about food, there were several other people writing about it at the same time, and I felt under the gun. But one thing I'd like to add to that is that the very first person I interviewed when I began to write about psychedelics and how to change your mind was David Presti. So he was my teacher before he was all of yours. And I knew him by reputation. I think we'd met socially a couple times, and I had sat in on some sessions of Drugs in the Brain, which is a legendary course at Berkeley, easily one of the most popular that is taught there. And so anyway, when we started talking about doing a massive online course, there was just no question that we should share him with the world, and that there is so much wisdom. And the thing that's amazing about David and the lesson I took away from those early interviews with him is that he somehow manages to combine a powerful sense of wonder and awe at what these substances can do and their role in human culture, with a great deal of caution and skepticism. He is not someone to look at a brain scan and be immediately sold that it's actually telling us anything of any import. And I remember his cautionary words to me as much as anything. And this quality of doing evidence-based, skeptical, sober, whether it's our journalism or our teaching, is really a hallmark of BCSP, that we're really trying to cut against the hype, which is consuming psychedelics right now. And David has always been a voice of anti-hype. So anyway, I feel very fortunate to have been able to work with him.
Thanks, Michael. And I wondered if I could stay on that point for a bit longer. The last time that you and I think, saw each other in person was in Denver. We were both at the MAPS conference, Psychedelic Science 2023. And I think you just delivered a session called Tempering Psychedelics. And you were doing that with BCSP advisor Bob Jesse. Could you say a bit about why you felt that session in particular was important? Why do we need to temper psychedelics? And how do educational offerings like Psychedelics in the Mind fit into that new landscape?
Well, Denver, when 12 or 13,000 people, all enthusiastic about psychedelics, showed up in one place, Bob and I felt there was a room for another kind of voice than what was the common one. Bob came up with the title, and Bob is a stickler for language. And by tempering psychedelics, he meant two things. He meant tempering the enthusiasm a little bit, which risks getting out of hand. But he also meant tempering in the sense of tempering steel, which is to say making something stronger. And I think we both agreed that we are at this peak psychedelic enthusiasm. There's an irrational exuberance about psychedelics, and that a measure of sobriety and attention to risk was what was needed and is still needed, I think. And when I talk about risk, I'm talking about risk to individuals, which is real. People having, disastrous trips because they're using psychedelics in a careless way. But the risks of abuse by therapists, which is real. There's risk to the research enterprise that we have to look at. And there's risk to capital. A lot of people are already losing a lot of money in the psychedelic space. So all these forms of risk need a little more attention than they're getting, and we thought we could provide it. There are people who are being hurt, and there are challenges to doing the research too that don't get talked about enough. No one's really figured out the placebo issue. It's very difficult to do, and there's researcher bias and all these kind of things, and that needs attention too. So this is part of our whole project. It wasn't just this talk. In our journalism at BCSP and in this course, we're really trying to, throw a little cold water on myths and exaggerations, and we feel that by doing so, we'll strengthen the field and really try to prevent the kind of backlash that happened in the 70s and closed down research last time. We're finding out so many important things about mental health, about the way the mind works and goals work, about critical periods of development, that to shut down this research now because there was some sort of moral panic around psychedelics would just be a disaster. So we see that as our role, is keeping everybody from getting over their skis.
Absolutely. And just to echo a kind of common theme that's recurring is that the longer I spend in this role and in the field, the more I realize there's far, far, far more that we don't know about psychedelics than we do. And the importance of research and the importance of coming to this with an open mind and learning more is something that's really core to what the BCSP is trying to do. Nicole, I wanted to come to you next. Firstly, thank you so much for bringing psychedelics and the mind to life. I've honestly never seen anything like it in terms of a kind of multimedia educational course, and we're really indebted to your amazing work. I wanted to ask, in terms of the experience you've helped create, what are you most hoping that people will take away from Psychedelics and the Mind when they take the course?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be amongst everyone here and everyone out there in the world in the future and whenever you tune in. I really feel that my intention was accessibility. There's a lot of ideas that we've even talked about now on our call, just in the 20 minutes we've been on, and I always think of the audience. So I always think of, somebody brand new, really keen to learn, but looking for an on-ramp in some way. So then I get David, who is like the ultimate on-ramp. You just have to reach him with the right vehicle. And so we work together really well to do that together. And so the goal for me was accessibility, making sure that of all the research that's being done and all the people that are contributing to this field, that we were able to meet people where they were at and also go deeper with facts, make sure that we could cover everything accurately. I have one joke, David, I hope you don't mind my saying, but I asked him one time about Smurfs and why they're blue, because I had read online in the hype of it all, blue Smurfs is associated with psilocybin. And our excellent instructor said, I'm not qualified to talk about Smurfs. So that's who our teacher is. He's excellent, he's factual, he cares about us learning. And so essentially I wanted you to take away David as an instructor and just, trusting what he cares about and then knowing how to ingest it, and then developing the curiosity in anyone who's tuning in to be empowered to know where to look, because there's a lot of places you can look for information online. And I just felt really responsible to make sure that the people we involved and the way we spoke about it, that we covered that very patiently and it really expanded it out. I also really care about nature. And so in the graphics of the course or the visuals of the course, I wanted people to feel immersed in the land in some way. You know, we're in a digital platform, so Lord knows where we're at physically, but if we can also learn and also be around nature, there's a lot of trees in the course and there's just a lot of grounding in the course. So that was kind of the other takeaway I really hope people will get an appreciation of.
And I just want to echo that, you know, again, I'm really happy for the experience that so many learners will have when they first see the visual look and the feel of the course. I was blown away when I first saw it, even after having seen the content. So I'm really excited for everyone else. Obviously, you've made films about a huge range of different topics. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what was the most kind of challenging or perhaps the most interesting thing for you as a producer to be making something about psychedelics as opposed to any other topic.
Well, psychedelics feel like they have a life of their own. So frequently when you approach a topic, it's historically, or it's, you know, there's a different survey that you can approach, a style you can approach. With documentary filmmaking, this felt very alive. And there was so much rich content that David had access to and could share. The challenge really was, how do we narrow it down? And then how do we weave together the 12 excellent voices into what David is teaching? Because we don't want to go on tangents. We really want to supplement the main teachings from his incredible course at Berkeley, but we also wanted to give people something that they hadn't heard before, which, you know, the points of views that are more, you know, maybe psilocybin from Maria Sabina's point of view, or, you know, there's lots of different ways that I wanted to approach it with David. Yeah. Thank
you so much.
You're welcome.
David, I wanted to come back to you now if I can. Obviously, we're at a really interesting moment in psychedelic science. You know, I know that there's frustration with the term psychedelic renaissance because psychedelic science never went away, but there is this kind of resurgence and renewed interest in the field. I'm hoping that one of the things that the course does is give people a baseline to understand what's the history and what's the science so far. But looking to the future, you know, armed with that baseline, armed with that knowledge of what's been done in history, what are you most excited about for the future of the field? What do you most want to learn about psychedelic science, and what are you anticipating the future direction of knowledge will take us?
Well, I'll break my answer into two pieces. One is, of course, there's great interest in understanding what is the biophysical mechanism by which psychedelics do their thing. And we have a way of understanding even the properties of plants and mushrooms as based on primarily the actions of one or a few individual molecular substances within the plant, say. And so investigating how a particular molecule like LSD or psilocybin or DMT or mescaline or any number of other things interacts with the brain and the body, and what is it that it's doing that actually catalyzes some kind of possibility of transformations, or transformation away from clinical symptomatology, transformation into a realm of seeing the world more flexibly, relearning things and so forth. So what are the mechanisms of that? Things like Gould is doing with this combination of a molecular property and the environment, you know, the social learning environment and so forth. So that's one hugely important area of science, which will continue to grow. But my hope is that folks will think about this expansively. Personally, I don't think it's going to be reduced to some simple property of being able to induce neuroplasticity or something like that. It'll be a much more complex orchestration of things, and that will teach us a lot, I think, about how we interact with the world. So that's one thing. For me, I think the most exciting thing that could happen, which is much more vague, really, and tenuous, is that if we think of psyche in a more broad way, not just personal thoughts, feelings, memories, and so forth, perceptions, but some kind of connection with a larger manifestation of mind, something that every spiritual tradition has, every indigenous worldview has, and even Europeans had up until a few hundred years ago. So there's more going on to the way the mind, as we experience it, is interacting with reality than I think we're normally aware of. Psychedelics open a door or a portal to appreciating that somewhat more deeply. And if we could somehow more empirically and allow ourselves to take a look at that and see how that will inform our scientific paradigm more broadly defined. For me, that's the most exciting thing, that it will open up a whole new, broader way of understanding what we call mind or consciousness and how it interacts with what we call the physical world, and that things are much more enfolded than we normally see them to be.
Yeah, and again, hopefully right topic for getting into in the Q&A. Thank you, David. But Gul, I wanted to stay on that same theme for you. I know lots of people who are taking the course and also people in the audience today will have read the reports about the potential of psychedelics for mental health treatments. It's very, very well reported, and some of the early impacts look like they could be extraordinary. I understand your work connects some of the clinical applications with the basic science. Could I ask you, in your view, why is the fundamental research so important? And what are the biggest unknowns in terms of linking the basic science to the potential clinical applications?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And, I think that there's a tendency to, at the very beginning of when I started working on this, I would try and explain why I thought it was so important to understand the mechanism. And I'd get pushback from people who would say, well, these are traditional medicines, they work, they've been in the underground for a long time, and all we're doing in clinical trials is just, formalizing that. And I very much felt like, well, no, actually, I think we need to understand how and why they're working, because it'll inform, clinical trial design. But also, I don't believe that we can just take a medicine that's been used in a certain culture, take out the chemical that is implicated in those effects and just pluck it out in a totally different context, use it in the same way. And I think that understanding the mechanism can not only put it in the context that we're trying to use these compounds in, but will also give us insight into how they are working and where we're not using them appropriately and where there are other opportunities. And so I can give the example, and to me, this kind of folds into the second part of your question, which is, to me, the most exciting part of psychedelics research moving forward is trying to understand the context dependence. People will talk about this, either as the set and setting dependence. And I think we've known for a long time that, depending on what mindset you're in, depending on what setting you're in, the same exact compound can have a very different effect, right? And we don't really understand how that's happening. I think our critical period opening explanation offers some clues and actually challenges some of the biochemical models we've had around depression and anxiety, and looking for ways to just, reset some biochemical imbalance that, we've been assuming is the cause of depression, because we're getting such remarkable results with psychedelics that are context dependent. We have a lot of evidence that, if you give psychedelics in a psychotherapeutic context, you can have these remarkable lasting effects. But if you don't give them in that context, or the mindset isn't set up properly, then these effects are not as robust and not really that different from, antidepressants or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? And so understanding that, I think, is going to be the thing moving forward. And for me, we have this this hypothesis really that, if we change the context, we can change which disease we might be able to use these drugs to address, right? So we think that if we're trying to correct, post-traumatic stress disorder type of disease, then, we want the context to be around psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and trying to understand the source of that trauma. But we have some enthusiasm for the hypothesis that if we change that, say, to a motor context, then it might be useful for treating neurological diseases like, helping people to recover after they've had a stroke. And so we don't know that to be true yet, but and it's to me the most exciting area of research moving forward, because if it is true, then it really opens up all kinds of other diseases that we might want to use psychedelics to help treat.
Such an amazing tease there, Gul, and I'd love to hear more about that. I think the potential you're talking about is really phenomenal. But I'm going to go back to Michael again for a moment. Michael, we at the BCSP recently did the very first Berkeley psychedelic survey, and we found that there's just huge public interest in psychedelics and psychedelic science still. We found that over 3/4 of the public want there to be more research. We found that 61% of the public were ready for policy change to make access to psychedelics easier. You've written about so many other topics apart from psychedelics. What is it, do you think, that makes psychedelics so compelling in the public sphere right now? And allied to that question, I wonder if you could touch on again, why does that mean that journalism is so important, in terms of the independent critical inquiry around this topic?
Well, I've been surprised at the speed at which the public has taken up psychedelics as a cause, as something they're just curious about. I've never seen anything quite like it. And I'm hard pressed to say exactly why it is. I mean, I do think these are trends that were exacerbated by COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown, that I think people are struggling with their mental health. And there's a recognition, I think, both among patients and providers of mental health, that the tools that we have aren't very good. And they're not even working as well as they once did. I mean, I'm talking about things like SSRIs. And, when I published How to Change Your Mind, which was, generally very positive about the potential of psychedelic therapy to treat things like depression, end-of-life anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and addiction, I really expected a lot of pushback from the mental health establishment, from prominent psychiatrists and psychologists and institutions. And I was very surprised that it didn't come. And I remember after the book came out, interviewing Tom Insel, who had been head of the National Institute of Mental Health. And I had originally reached out to him when an editor asked, who thought I had written a piece that was a little too pro psychedelic therapy, to find some big shot who thinks this is all bullshit. That was my marching order to my editor. So I instantly called. I figured he was a big shot. He was head of National Institute of Mental Health, and surely he would be skeptical of psychedelic therapy. And I got him on the phone. He was in Davos, I think. I had very little time to do this interview, and he was like, and I teed up a question that was meant to elicit a pretty negative quote, because that's what I needed. And he said, no, I think this research is really important. We need this. We need new tools. And when I met him later, he explained that basically that the performance of mental health treatment is just nowhere near the performance of any other branch of medicine. And if you look at oncology or cardiology or infectious disease, all these fields have saved lives in great numbers, has made important discoveries. And then you look at mental health, and we have SSRIs that were introduced in the early 80s that work for some people, but not for for many of whom they don't. They're basically addictive, very hard to get off, and they're fading in their effectiveness. And so what Insel told me was, I came to understand why the mental health community has actually embraced this research. Of course, they still want to see more. They want to see larger phase 3 studies, and that makes very good sense. But I do think the crisis around mental health is real, and along comes psychedelics with the potential, at least, to address it. So I think that's a big part of it. I think people have been cooped up and they're looking to journey in whatever way they can. And transcendence, which is always popular, is more popular now than it's been in a long time. So people are hungry for consciousness change and for healing. And I think that, as best as I can tell, is what's driving this interest.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to go to Nicole with one last question, and then we're going to be going into the audience Q&A. So if you've been eagerly waiting to ask your question, I see some have been filtered in. Please get them ready. I do want to say that unfortunately we can't answer any medical questions or offer medical advice. So if you do have questions of that kind, unfortunately we can't help you with this event, but obviously there are some resources on the BCSP website at psychedelics.berkeley.edu that can help guide you to the right place. But if you have questions for our expert panel members, please do start typing them in. But as I say, Nicole, coming back to you, one thing that really stood out to me about the course and some of the content you produced was your focus on gratitude, and particularly gratitude towards elders. You know, there's so many people you helped David interview for the course, from, you know, indigenous practitioners to amazing scientists and everyone in between. Could you tell us a bit more about why you had that focus on gratitude and elders, and what you learned from that in making the course?
Thank you for that question. And Michael, I love your point about healing. Everyone is really looking for healing right now. And I think it ties into the intention behind elders, and just, you know, everyone who sat in the chair across from David arrived with mountains of knowledge that they probably didn't get all themselves. And so in this sort of filming setting, I just wanted to, I always think of the audience. So I was thinking of the people out there who maybe didn't have the space in their own life to think of gratitude or hold space for gratitude. And when they come into a learning environment where there's incredible experts before them, they might think that those experts were born that way. And I'm laughing because it's a really humbling experience to give thanks. So every expert we talked to, every external voice we talked to, knew how they were helped by their mentors, by their abuelos, by their a teacher who took a shot with them, somebody that opened a door for them. And I think that as a learner, if we begin there with gratitude, then in their own space, in their own life, in their own way, they can kind of figure out who they will help moving forward. It's kind of a, you know, it's, we're all connected, and especially in an educational way. Our knowledge, the way that I learn, will impact the people I love in my family and the people that I have connection to. Same with all of you. The way you speak and the way you teach, all of that is like one big mass, woven mass of knowledge. And so what I really intended on doing is not for camera necessarily, but asking everyone, will you give us an elder acknowledgement? And part of me was nervous because I come from a shamanic practitioner background, and I was thinking, is this the right environment to ask this type of question? But it was absolutely the right environment, and we really held space for just all this knowledge to come. I'm quite sure the experts before us really remembered their elders and their mentors, and that made the course that much more rich. So that's why I did that. And thanks for letting me talk about that. It's really important to me.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Okay, we have lots of questions starting to come in. Two of the audience members have asked a similar question. One question from David Pham: is a degree in pharmacology or psychology or some variation necessary to be involved in the research into psychedelic research? And similarly, another person that wants to ask, do you have any advice for those wanting to contribute to research or the future of psychedelics who don't have a research background or a STEM background? So clearly people want to further the field and help make a difference, but don't necessarily have that kind of clinical or basic science background. David or Gul or Michael, I don't know if there's anything that you want to offer there in terms of ways that people can help and get involved. David.
I can say something. I think those kinds of degrees in pharmacology or you know, something from the science and technology fields, of course, can open up certain pathways of opportunity. this subject is way bigger than that, way bigger than that. And so practically any discipline can contribute in some way to this. I mean, certainly there are a lot of clinical disciplines when it comes to interacting with the world, but thinking about things like anthropology and really trying to understand how this is playing out not only in other cultures, but in our own, or social psychology, or any number of history and philosophy, any number of different components of what are collectively called the humanities can be hugely important. And in fact, one of our stated missions at the BCSP, because we're not a clinical institution, we're a highly transdisciplinary, broadly represented academic institution. And so to really leverage all these other fields in the service of this topic.
And Michael, I know, yes, go on.
Yeah, I'll add something to that. For people who want to get directly involved, there is, there's going to be a tremendous need for trained guides, people who will prepare patients for psychedelic experience, who will sit with them when they're having it, and then help them integrate the experience after. There's several training programs around the country, including one at BCSP that just graduated its first cohort of trained guides. But that's another way, if you're inclined toward that sort of work. It's really important. MAPS estimated that we will need 10,000 trained guides in the next 10 years. And there's several places where you can get that training. I just want to also pick up on something David said. You would be mistaken if you thought this course was, since he's a neuroscientist, that it's, pure neuroscience. It is deeply interdisciplinary, and there is plenty of culture to go with the science and the nature. And this, I think, is it's a hallmark of David's approach, but it's also a hallmark of the field. And it's one of the reasons, as a writer, I have found it so compelling for the last, 8 years that I've been writing about it. It reminds me a lot of food, a subject I used to write about and still do occasionally, in that it is one of these areas where you just pull one thread and the whole world comes with it. And yes, you need to know something about science, but you also need to know something about social history and political history and policy and psychology and philosophy. I mean, it's just amazing how many different disciplines converge on this subject. And I think that's one of the reasons it has sustained my interest. And it's one of the really exciting things about this course, that there are very few people equipped to teach something that interdisciplinary. And we're very fortunate to have one of them.
Completely agree on that. Thank you for that, Michael. Gul, I want to come to you next with a couple of questions that are aimed specifically at you. Well, actually, one is someone, Burton Tabak, who just wanted to say he's your #1 fan and extend his gratitude. But there's two questions. Abby Lutz wants to know, do octopuses produce endogenous DMT? So DMT is one of the active ingredients in ayahuasca, and it's been found in certainly in humans. And there's a question about whether it's also present in octopuses. And another person wants to know, given your background studying autism, do you think there's utility and potential for psychedelics to reopen critical periods for autistic individuals with the appropriate context? So that's your stage to talk about autism and about octopus brains.
Okay, well, so for the octopus DMT question, we actually don't know. I mean, things are with the octopus, we're just finishing up the genome of a different species than we did that experiment on. There's so much to learn from octopuses, and actually octopuses and psychedelics is an interesting area for me because we have so many open questions about critical periods and evolution. Do octopuses even have critical periods? We don't know. They may, but they may not, because, for example, one of the things that we think of as why critical periods exist is because, there aren't enough genes to encode everything that we might have to learn in the world. But we also might need to turn that down at some point, because in order to navigate the world in a stable way, it's probably better not to be relearning the world, at every stage. And an octopus, they can regrow their limbs, so maybe they don't have critical periods for motor learning, for example. We don't know. So there's lots to do. We're going to do it, but I don't have an answer to that specific question. And then the second question was, remind me.
It was about autism and critical periods, but actually I wonder if you could perhaps define for all of us what critical period is and perhaps give an example.
Right. So I think that most people intuitively understand what critical periods are. It's just a fancy word to to describe the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That pretty much captures this idea that as the brain matures, its ability to sensitively respond to the world and learn, really robust patterns of activity goes down. And so the one that most people are familiar with is the critical period for language. So that's the reason why, it's so much easier to learn your first language than for most people, trying to pick up a second language as an adult is very difficult. And even if you do, you have an accent, you have to sort of formally train it. Whereas when you were a kid and you were learning your first language, that process was pretty easy. And that's the sort of classic critical period. And so, with autism, it's a little bit tricky. So we certainly see a potential opportunity to treat autism, by reopening social critical periods in adulthood, and then pairing that with other manipulations that we think are going to be specific for the type of autism that we're trying to treat. That being said, there is some evidence that, one of the ways that autism comes about is that it might be a failure to properly close critical periods, right? So I'm a little bit nervous about just jumping in and trying to reopen critical periods in a group of people for whom that process is already disrupted in some way. So I think we need to exercise caution before just jumping in and treating patients with autism with psychedelics.
It's another big theme today. Thank you, Gul, for that emphasis on caution and taking things slowly. David, I think the next question is for you. This is from Amanda Mahaffey. Amanda says, I'm currently taking the class and almost finished. She intends to develop her own class as a psychology professor at University of Colorado Boulder. And she wonders, what advice would you have for her in developing her course for undergraduates?
I guess make your coverage of the subject broad, in that you don't narrowly focus just on, say, the chemistry or the neuroscience or the psychology, but all of those, and also the history. And the history is there for a reason. The history is not there just for entertainment purposes, but is to hopefully illustrate important ways to think creatively about a subject, and also to appreciate the origins of how we think about these materials actually defines kind of a box by which we think about them in, and then to work to bring in other material that will get us out of that box a little bit, because the future will be different from the past, hopefully, and will be informed by the past. So I would say bring all those things in and weave them together in whatever ways most excite you.
Thank you, David. We have time for a few more questions. There's one from Ben Curbs. Given the historical roots of certain psychedelics within specific cultures, how are traditional perspectives and voices being included in the dialogue and research being done at the BCSP? Nicole, I know we were talking about this in terms of some of the course content. I wondered if you could perhaps reflect on that.
Absolutely. We worked with a beautiful expert, Susana Bustos, and when we were speaking with her, she really talked about this idea of the inherent systems of safety that arrive with indigenous cultures because of their years and years and years of use with these substances. So what I loved and appreciated about her indigenous perspective, and we got it from a number of other experts, Dr. Andrea Gomez, Sylvester Quevedo. It's a really rich course with this sort of indigenous perspectives that we kind of begin from. But Susanna, I think, took it, for me, deeper in a way, because she talked about the sacrifices of the plants. And it was such a curious point of view, because she said a lot of people, you know, when they take the plant, you know, they have their experience, but she says, you know, when you consider the sentience of that being, what are you doing for that plant after you've ingested it? You know, how is your life changing because of that contribution of that plant? And I absolutely love and respect those points of view, because it just broadens out these ideas around the very valuable ideas around neuroscience and education. But it just kind of lands in your body differently, especially when it's cased with a lot of facts and a lot of safe information. So you get an opportunity really to, I guess, expand your heart and mind. How to change your mind, how to change your heart. How's that, Michael?
I like it.
Nice.
Michael, earlier you mentioned the placebo problem, and there's a question about that. Someone said, you know, what is a placebo problem? Could you elaborate on that when it comes to psychedelic research? I don't know if you want to take that, or perhaps Gul.
Sure. Well, I can take it. Well, if you think about it, most people know they've ingested a psychedelic, and so it's very hard to blind a study, and also their guides know that they've consumed a psychedelic, because the effects are usually so pronounced and obvious. So researchers have done this in various ways. There are many trials that use niacin at high dose, which gives you a sense of something mind-altering. You feel flushed, you feel warm. Others have used a small dose of psychedelics, 1 milligram rather than 25. So everybody knows they're getting psychedelics and may have some sort of experience just at the suggestion, as people on microdosing do. But nobody's really solved the problem in a way that is effective. I don't think it's going to stop the research from being accepted. I think the FDA has indicated that they're okay with the kind of blinding that's been going on. But it's definitely a challenge that the researchers spend a lot of time trying to figure out a solution to.
Thanks, Michael. And certainly that speaks to the idea as well that, you know, as you say, just feeling like you've had an intervention can make you feel better. And it's hard to separate that out from the effects of any kind of active ingredient.
And some people are fooled. I mean, I've heard cases where both the guides and the patients were sure that volunteers were sure this person had gotten psilocybin, and they hadn't. So you know, these drugs are very suggestible, and the power of suggestion, which is always powerful, is much more so in the case of psychedelics. Hence the popularity of microdosing, which, you know, may not be a chemical effect at all.
I think we have time for one very last quick question, and this one is going back to Gul. It's from Juliana Cuartas. Could you speak more to the shared cell and molecular mechanisms underlying the mammalian/octopus response to MDMA? What do these findings lead you to speculate?
Okay. Well, I mean, the things that one of the things that we started out with, you know, when I was first drawn to psychedelics as a research question, actually was when I was an undergrad. And just to kind of speak to the interdisciplinary notion of this, I had designed my own major, and it was comparative perspectives on the mind. And it was really, you know, bringing together neuroscience and philosophy and linguistics and art, you know, to try and understand this notion of consciousness and mind. And one of the things that really struck me at the beginning, and I think a lot of people have this insight, is that, you know, the serotonin molecule looks so similar to, you know, LSD or psilocybin backbone. And that similarity really drew me towards a molecular understanding of how psychedelics are working in the brain. And so one of the first things that we sought out to test is, what is the similarity across psychedelics at the molecular level? And we were a little bit surprised to find out that, even though the serotonin 2A receptor is the one that everybody's super excited about as maybe being this common mechanism, what we found is that, yes, some of the psychedelics seem to be having their effects through that receptor, but many of them are not. And so that is really pulling us away from this notion of, a single receptor that can explain it all, to a broader understanding of what are the commonalities between all of these drugs that sit in different receptors, and how are they activating similar cascades of biochemical events and molecular events and changes at the DNA and RNA level. And so we're starting to look for those commonalities across drugs. And then I'll just say, going back to this idea of interdisciplinary and, these other things that are happening besides just at the level of molecules, we're beginning to get interested in the idea that there are other ways of reopening critical periods that have been known for a long time, and that we're discovering as well, that have potentially mechanistic overlap, which we're still trying to figure out, but also phenomenological overlap, right? So when you do these very long deprivation experiments, you can reopen critical periods. And it turns out that there are a lot of religious practices, for example, that use deprivation techniques as a way of getting to that mystical state, or the beginner's mind, or having an epiphany or a religious experience sort of engendered by these other ways. So I think that narrowly focusing just on a receptor is not going to give us the whole answer. And what I love about this moment in psychedelics research is that, we're starting to get enough of a mechanistic handle that we can compare across things that seem like they don't have anything to do with each other, like meditations and silent retreats, and taking a drug and understanding the commonalities, both in terms of the molecular properties, but also in terms of the phenomenological properties.
Sadly, we are out of time, but what a wonderful point to end on. Thank you so much, Gul. We could go on for hours, but if you want to hear more from all of our speakers, please do take Psychedelics and the Mind. They all appear in much greater length on that course. It's free and online now. The link is in the chat. If you want to hear more about the BCSP, please sign up for our newsletter. I've also dropped the link to that in the chat. I also want to say a big thanks to our donors. All of the BCSP's work is supported by philanthropy, and Psychedelics in the Mind in particular. Our course was supported by the Stephen Alexander Cohen Foundation, and we're really grateful for their support that's made the course possible and made it enabled us to make it available free. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, David. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Gul. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope to see you around. Take care.
Bye-bye.